All right, thank you everyone for being here today. I see we've got some participants slowly trickling into the room. I know there is a changeover between Zoom and Whova, so we are being mindful of that. So come on in and go ahead and get settled. My name is Nicole Drumhiller, and I am the Associate Dean for the School of Security and Global Studies at American Public University System. Today, we're going to do a panel on space economic policy and analysis. And with me today, I have Tina Highfill from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, Kevin O'Connell, the former Director of Space Commerce, former Director, Office of Space Commerce, Nicholas Borroz at the University of Auckland, and Laura Forczyk, space scientist and industry analyst, consultant, and owner of Astralytical, if I'm getting that correct. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tina first, and then we'll have Kevin, and then Nicholas, and then Laura. And then we'll leave it open for question and answer at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tina, and I will be going on mute.
Great, thank you, Nicole. Hi, everybody. My name is Tina Highfill. I'm a research economist at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. Thank you for having me today. I'm excited to talk about new economic statistics that we published for the first time at BEA last December that quantifies the U.S. space economy. Before I jump into talking about the statistics, I wanted to give a little bit of background about BEA and the project, just so people have context. If you're not familiar with BEA, we produce some of the official economic statistics for the United States, most notably gross domestic product, or GDP. We produce hundreds of other statistics as well, including information on employment, wages, gross output, international trade. And when we publish those statistics, we typically publish them by major industry sector. So if you hear about the economy growing or shrinking, we typically will say, what is driving that growth? Is it manufacturing? Is it construction? Is it finance? And so that's how we typically think about economic statistics at BEA. And these statistics are used by policymakers, business people, researchers to understand the makeup of the economy and trends over time, among other things. So with these economic statistics, sometimes there's economic activity that transcends those industry sectors, and space is one of them. If you think about space economic activity, within manufacturing, you have satellite manufacturing, space vehicle manufacturing, ground equipment, space weapons. Within finance, you have insurance for launch. Within information, you have satellite television, satellite telecommunications, and so on. And so space activity is really spread across all of the major sectors in the economy. When Kevin O'Connell, one of my co-panelists, was the director of the Office of Space Commerce at Department of Commerce, he reached out to BEA to see what we could do about, isolating the space activity within these industries. Because if you're just looking at our standard economic statistics, it's hard to parse out, what is space activity. So we engaged on this project to quantify the US space economy using the same foundation, the same methods and data we use to measure the overall economy. And I won't get into too much detail. We do have a report online with methodology and to explain kind of, in more detail how we came up with these statistics. But just in summary, what we did is at BEA, we have a list of all the goods and services produced in the United States. And that's how we measure the overall economy. We look at production of goods and services. So for the space economy, we went through and said, of these goods and services, what is specific to space activity? And we reached out to a lot of industry people, government people, both domestic and international. Kevin knows everybody in the space world, and he was able to hook me up with all of these great people to help us, come up with good statistics. And so in December of last year, we published estimates of US space economy, GDP, employment, compensation, and gross output. And I'd like to share my screen really quick so I can show you one of the charts, which is one of our major takeaways from this project. So what this shows is gross output for the US space economy by major industry from 2012 to 2018. And gross output, if you're not familiar, is really just similar to revenue or sales. And if you've ever read the Space Foundation report or the Satellite Industry Association report, they typically produce estimates by revenue. And so that's why I wanted to show gross output, because it's a similar metric. So what this chart is showing is from 2012 to 2018, the US space economy grew from 163 billion in gross output to 178 billion. And that translates to about 0.5 percentage point of the overall US economy. And while that may sound small, it's actually significant. If you think about other sectors in our economy, like agriculture only represents about 1% of the overall US economy. Mining is about 1.5%. So 0.5% may sound small, but it's actually very significant. And so what we see here is, I'll just focus on 2018, which is the most recent year that we were able to publish last December. Information is the largest sector in the space economy. And a lot of this is satellite television, direct-to-home satellite television. But there's also satellite telecommunications, which is like the resale of satellite services, and also some computer and software design included in this sector. You may notice that it declined from 2017 to 2018, and this is really driven by a contraction in satellite television subscribers and revenue. And you can see it's actually dragging down the total US space economy numbers because it is such a large part, or at least it was in 2018. The next biggest sector is manufacturing at 48 billion in 2018. And this covers a lot of different goods and services. So a lot of this is satellite manufacturing and ground equipment. It's also GPS, PNT equipment, space weapons. And you'll see if you look across the years, this is also declining. And this isn't as straightforward as what's going on in information. Within manufacturing, what we think, what appears to be happening is that there's an increase in productivity. So, you know, manufacturing of satellites or spacecraft, they've seen kind of increases in innovation that has actually lowered the cost of production. So even if there's more production of satellites, if it's cheaper, you know, our manufacturing value will go down over time, which is that's what it looks like is happening in this scenario. The third largest industry is wholesale trade. And this is something you don't typically see in space reports. But wholesale trade is a really important part of our economy. Wholesale trade is just the distribution of goods. So if you think about, you know, you go to the grocery store, you might go to Kroger or Wegmans and pick up food. The grocery store is a retail industry. And they typically get their goods from a distributor. You know, they don't go to each farm to get milk or eggs. They go to a distributor to get their goods. And so in the case of space, if you think about all of the goods that are embedded in other manufactured goods that we use every day, like cell phones or ATMs or cars, you know, when a car manufacturer wants a GPS unit, they'll go to a distributor to get that GPS unit, as one example. So wholesale trade is a really big part of the space economy, and it's growing pretty quickly. The fourth largest industry is government, and this refers to government spending and government production by employees. It's not total government spending. It's just the spending related to like the NASA employees. Space Force isn't in these statistics because this is only through 2018, but if we continue, you know, it'll be Space Force and things like federally funded research and development centers like JPL. So this is about 21 billion in 2018. And then finally, professional and business services is the fifth largest industry. And this includes a lot of different things: R&D, remote sensing services, aerospace engineering. So there's a lot going on in these different sectors. And if you go to our website and you're interested, there is more detail. You know, we have more data tables with detail about these individual sectors. I mentioned that the space economy touches every, you know, sector in the U.S. economy, which is true, but they are the space economy is dominated by these 5 individual sectors. I mentioned earlier that gross output is similar to revenue, and I also mentioned the Space Foundation report. If you're familiar with that report, you may be wondering why our numbers are different from there. So the Space Economy Report for 2018, I think they estimated about $400 billion. The space economy is $400 billion. There's a few differences that between gross output and revenue, so they're not the exact same thing, but the biggest difference is that the Space Foundation measures the global space economy, and at BEA, we just measure the US economy. We measure what's produced in the United States. So that's the biggest difference between our numbers and the Space Foundation numbers. That question comes up a lot, so I just wanted to point that out. So that was just a really brief overview of these statistics. As I said, we have other statistics online. If you're interested, it's bea.gov. We've planned to put out new statistics at the end of this year that'll go through 2019. We'll also put out inflation-adjusted statistics as well. And we have contact information on our website if you'd like to give feedback or if you have any questions or comments. We're always interested to hear from our data users. So thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Tina. And now we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Kevin O'Connell.
Thanks, Nicole. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on this distinguished panel. Nice to be on a panel with my former colleague, Tina Highfill, as well. You know, I was having a bit of a melancholy moment today when I was preparing for this because the first time I met Secretary Ross, the first question he asked me was, "Hey, Kevin, why is the Commerce Department involved in space?" And I'd actually thought about that quite a bit. And at the end of the day, it wound up being the pathway to a job that I had for, better part of 2.5 years, and a lot of other exciting thinking about this specific issue of the economic issues. And I guess bottom line up front is that for all of the marvelous technical developments that we're seeing in the space economy, there are an equal number of important economic and policy questions that have to be worked in parallel. And that's one of the things I've tried to spend some time on since I left the government 8 months ago. And let me, Nicole, if you'll allow me, let me just drop a handful of them out, and we can pick various ones up in the questions, later on. And I'd sort of focus on 4 categories. The first is the one that Tina's just focused on. How do we account for the space economy? I'm an old RAND guy, and so I care a lot about numbers and how they're developed. And, we often hear the $450 billion number, and we hear about $1 to $3 trillion in the next 2 decades and things like that for the space economy. But how rigorous are those numbers? And compliments to Tina and her team, because I think they did a great job doing a couple of things. One, bringing more rigor to our methodologies for thinking about the space economy and accounting for it, but also aligning those with the way we account for other national economic statistics. And Tina was too humble to say it, but that work attracted the attention of a lot of people around the world. We are all excited about this on this phone call, but finance ministers, other people that have to invest in the space economy compared to defense or health or other priorities, they want a better understanding of what return they're getting out of the space economy. And again, I think everybody here would agree it's far beyond what we already calculate. And so that's a very important piece of this. What do we count? How do we count it? That's a first big category. And again, compliments to my former colleagues and the work they're doing in that area, and others around the world that are focused on this, work at the OECD and others. I'll drop a number of other things in the second. I'll call the second thing a set of subcategories where there are both important economic analysis, but also important economic policy issues. The first is, what's the role of governments in the market? And the extent to which we're moving from a predominantly state-funded system to one that's privately funded in space has all sorts of consequences. And what's the continuing role of government in that particular area from an economic perspective? Early investment, seed investment, things like that, all the way up to anchor customer, things like that. how are we dealing with buying capabilities? And, many times at Commerce, I talked about the fact that the US government was improving in the way it was dealing with buying commercial capabilities, but we're not quite over the hurdle yet. There's still some cultural impediments, and they vary by different organizations. There was a conversation about this last week out at the Space Debris Conference out in Maui. How does the government work as a buyer in this market, in addition to its other roles, et cetera? And then what are the other tools in the toolkit that the government has to affect this? So that's one very big category. Second, what's the role of private finance? I mean, we have an unprecedented level of private finance, $9 billion in 2020. Already at the end of the second quarter, we're already well ahead of that in 2021. What's the implication of that for the space economy? And it's overwhelmingly positive, but how do we think about the impact there? Third is regulation. How do we think about regulation? We're at a very interesting time globally where a handful of governments are trying to modernize regulations to keep up with the space economy, including the United States, but a number of other countries that are coming for the first time into the space economy, trying to understand how to govern in a responsible way. I used to joke with our colleagues in Australia who have a relatively new space agency, and I said, boy, it'd be fun to have a space agency that was only a couple of years old, because the regulatory environment there is very, very different. And there's tons of issues there. How do you sustain a positive business climate through regulation? How do you encourage business through regulation? How do you think about issues like space safety and sustainability, which I spent some part of every day on while at Commerce? How do you think about planetary protection as we're going to other planets and potentially coming back? I think everybody here knows the moon is right around the corner. I mean, a lot of folks still think the next thing that happens on the moon are the arrival of two astronauts, him and her. But in fact, that's the last phase of the next part of going to the moon. We're going to have infrastructure being built on the moon. We're going to have exploration and some mining of water ice and things like that. And we're even going to have people that are going to try to do things that we do on Earth and see if they can be done better, more efficiently on the moon, like data centers, for example. How do we think about encouraging the progression of the moon to an area of normal economic activity? Many, many other things in the regulatory bucket. How do you think about export controls, and how do you think about supply chain issues? Supply chain issues, very paradoxically, are ones where, for reasons related to national security, we're tightening supply chains. Those ironically have a stronger effect on smaller companies, which tend to rely on parts from around the world, than they do, say, on the traditional primes in this space. And so, big issues. Another topic, the role of state and local governments. We spent time at Commerce, and I've spent time since talking with other states that want to be part of the space economy. It's not just cheerleading. How do you actually encourage, how do you take stock of what exists in a state in the way of capabilities, and how do you actually move it into the space economy? So we've talked to folks in Wyoming and in South Carolina. We talked to folks in Connecticut previously. The issue of talent. Talent is very, very important. How do you encourage educational programs and the kinds of talent we'll need? We sometimes think that the only talent we need is the science and technical talent, but in fact, we need a very wide range of talent, very diverse set of talent to hit those $1 to $3 trillion numbers that people are talking about. We need people in the arts, we need people in business and law and economics and a dozen other areas, in addition to the technical talent. The third cluster of activities I would focus on are international activities. And while at Commerce, I spent a lot of time with countries that wanted to get involved early in the space economy. And when the way they think about this is that the space economy is a source of economic growth and skilled talent development and innovation in a very traditional way. How do they participate in this? what does competition and cooperation look like in terms of partnerships among countries, with countries, things like that. And of course, the role of China, which we focus on quite a bit. I've actually had a number of conversations with the Chinese, well, both in government, but even since. And what they talk about when they talk about commercialization is very, very different from what we talk about in the United States, and even with the more subtle debates we have with our allies and partners in this area. The last thing I'll mention is a little closer to home. We're looking more and more at the business of space. And so we need more academic treatment in particular of this. I've had a couple of discussions with major universities to say, hey, we need to focus on many of the issues that we're talking about here. And people say, well, those belong in our astronomy department, or they belong in some other technical department. And my answer is no, they don't. They actually need to be linked to those departments, but they need to be in a business school, or they need to be maybe in a policy school, things like that. And so we need work on business cases. What constitutes a successful space business? What can we learn from other industries? Just as an aside, I think the role of SPACs coming into the space economy very much will help bring new talent, new experiences from other industries in a way we just haven't seen before. It's happened in the past. But how do we focus on the business of space so that future companies will learn from the experiences of current companies? This is a normal market. Unlike in the past, this is very much a normal market, and we will see all manner of normal economic behavior. We'll see success, we'll see failure, we'll see merger and acquisition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what lessons can we learn so that the next generation of space companies actually wind up having a shot at being more successful than even the current slate of them? So Nicole, on that point, I'll stop. Threw a lot of things on the table. Maybe we can come back to them in questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Kevin. And now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nicholas.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Sweet. So hello, everyone from New Zealand. I read the purpose of this panel to basically be about the following question. How can the US government ensure desired outcomes in the space industry? Perhaps that is a misreading, but that is sort of the question which I've evolved my thoughts around. So again, in my mind, this sort of question that I'm focusing on is how can the US government ensure desired outcomes in the space industry? And there's two factoids about my background that inform my thinking on this, okay? One is just last week, I finished a PhD in comparative political economy, looking at how different governments intervene in markets. So it's kind of top of my mind at the moment. The second factoid about my background, which is relevant to the way I think about this, is although I am from the United States, I'm based in New Zealand, and I do consult for space sector clients, and none of them are in the United States. So this means that when I'm thinking about how can the US government use policy to achieve desired outcomes, I'm thinking of it first and foremost in like a sort of a comparative way about what makes the US government different than other governments, kind of like Kevin was talking about. Kevin was mentioning talking with Aussies. Well, here in New Zealand, well, we also have this same thing where it's like, we're 4 years into a space industry. What do we do? Which governments do we look to for inspiration? And there are many things that make the US government interventions in the space industry unique. But in my mind, perhaps just based off of the work that I'm doing, there's really two that really stand out. One is that the US government puts out tons of contracts. New Zealand has Rocket Lab. Rocket Lab is an American company now. Why? Massive government contracts is arguably one of the reasons. So all around the world, especially in countries that are sort of friendly with the United States, the US is the ultimate bonanza for money. So, that is where you go. That's how you know you've made it, is when you get a US government contract. So that's one aspect of US intervention in its space industry, which is unique, the massive amounts of contracts. And maybe that is, by the way, just a perception. Tina and Kevin doing the actual hard economic analysis perhaps is more of a reputation than reality, but that's the perception. The second aspect of US government intervention in the space industry, which to me seems to be quite unique, also alluded to by Kevin, is Itar, International Traffic in Arms Regulations. This basically has like the opposite effect in a way, because it makes any business that involves US and non-US persons a massive headache, especially for the small companies, as Kevin said. Big companies can include it in their budget. Small companies cannot. It is a huge hurdle, which, you know, as if you're in New Zealand or Australia, and these are friendly countries with the United States, a small company will almost, you know, sometimes think about avoiding the US entirely to avoid Itar. And in fact, in Australia, you know, Itar free business models are quite interesting at the moment, because yeah, you can have a competitive advantage in the world by being Itar free and avoiding the US market entirely. And then obviously that means that for firms in countries that have antagonistic relationships with the United States, or whatever the term is that is being flown around, I will say antagonistic, like China or Iran or North Korea or Russia, the US is completely off limits. So to go back to the question, how can the US government ensure desired outcomes in the space industry? Well, obviously, well, not obviously, but I believe it makes sense to think about using your unique interventions to bring about your desired outcome. So you must think about what is the US government good at doing and using those to achieve the desired outcome. So it's really kind of a two-step process, I think. Get a desired outcome, identify a desired outcome, and then use the interventions. I know that's kind of a simplistic thing, but that's sort of it. What is the outcome? What are our interventions? How can we use the interventions to get it? So for instance, you know, if a desired outcome, and this is funny, I think, because Tina was, you know, showing this graph of the big numbers getting bigger and bigger. Everyone oftentimes focuses on growth and absolute, I don't know, some sort of measure of value. A bigger number each year is better, but that's not necessarily a desired outcome. So oftentimes it is. I was thinking, you know, just hypothetically speaking, maybe a desired outcome is for the US to house more innovative space tech than any other country, for instance. And then if that's the goal, then going back to those two things I was talking about, the two notably unique interventions, contracts and Itar, how do you use contracts and Itar to achieve that? If you have too much Itar, firms are going to be Itar free and they're not going to go to the United States, and then you're not going to house as much tech as you want. You won't get Rocket Lab transferring a lot of their you know, activity to California. And then if Itar is too low, obviously you're going to have IP leakage, which is going to have a similar effect. You're going to lose, you're not going to be able to house all the space tech. So you got to get the right mix of the interventions. It's kind of like a Goldilocks zone. I don't know what the answer is, but you know, that's kind of, I think, the general approach. Goal, interventions, think about the right mix and do it. And it has to be the right mix. There has to be a lot of thinking that goes into that. I wanted to be pretty brief, so I'm almost done. There's just one last thing I'll say, sort of based on my studies. There's two things to me that seem to, regardless of whether you're the United States or China, there are two issues which often get in the way of governments achieving desired outcomes. One is trying to use interventions that don't fit, whatever that means, with your institutional sort of framework. Super debatable, but you know, some governments are more comfortable using certain interventions than others, like giant state-owned enterprises. China's a little bit more comfortable with that than the United States, arguably. So trying to find the right fit, using interventions which make sense based off your institutional sort of framework or your institutional mindset about what is appropriate behavior, which is why I say it kind of makes sense to think about the interventions which the US is already pretty good at, Itar and contracts. And then the second issue, which often stymies governments achieving their outcomes, their desired outcomes, I think, is lack of consistency, both with the outcome itself and then also consensus about how to achieve it. And that's particularly an issue in countries, pluralistic countries like the United States and New Zealand, arguably less so for more authoritarian countries like China or Singapore. So yeah, must keep that in mind. So wrapping everything I've set up then to answer that question about how can the US government ensure desired outcomes in the space industry, it's important to develop consensus about desired outcomes, use interventions which the government actually has skill using, and then stick with the plan for using those interventions over more than 1 or 2 or 3 election cycles. That's it.
Fairly uncomplicated, right, Nicholas?
Yeah, it's much easier, very easily done.
Right. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Laura next.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to my fellow panelists. It's been great so far. So I was specifically asked to talk about jobs, the talent that Kevin mentioned. So I'm going to start with that and then broaden the conversation. And one thing that Nicholas just mentioned quite a bit is Itar. So starting internationally, thinking about the US, I have a lot of coaching clients, individuals who come from around the world. A lot of them are here in the United States, but some of them are not. And the ones who are not have a bit of a conundrum. They can either come to the US where that's the most of the opportunities, that's where they're feeling called to most of the time when they talk to me, or they can stay where they are, or they can find somewhere where they can move to that is less complicated than the United States, because it is quite complex to get around Itar, to get a position if you are an international student or just an international person who, especially ones coming from certain countries that, for no fault of this individual, cannot find a friendly environment because of international relations with whatever country they're coming from. And I could list a whole bunch, but I won't. And so that makes it very challenging. And I know Itar has been reformed over the past few years, but it hasn't been enough to deter a lot of the talent coming into the United States that we want. Historically, United States has been very good at drawing people here and keeping them here, coming to universities from around the world to the United States, where they get degrees and then they stay here and they really benefit the cultural and educational and economic markets here in the United States. And especially we see this in the space industry where just starting from the very beginning, we had a lot of immigration to begin the space age here in the United States. I'm thinking specifically of Germany and places like that, Russia even a little bit. And so thinking still today, how can we allow more opportunity for students and recent graduates who want to work in the space industry to stay here, to both come here for their education and to stay here and get jobs here before they have the opportunity to apply to become naturalized citizens or green card holders. And I'm not a lawyer, so I cannot speak to the specifics of all of that. But that is one thing that I see a lot, that I'm always so my heart goes out to them because there's not much I can do for them. I can give them advice on how to, get a job where they are in whatever country they are, whether it's a space hub or not. And most of the time it's not, or how they can get a job in, the general European area, the general Asian area, wherever they happen to be, and find a position that is closer to home for them, that is more open. And me coming from a family of immigrants, as are probably most of the US listeners, this is something that I just feel passionately about, making sure that we can allow the people in who can really benefit both the space industry and our general economy. Thinking more close to home now, I talk to a lot of people about what makes up a space job. What is a space job? Because there's a stereotype that it's still just scientists and engineers. I myself am a scientist. And I know this is the majority of the jobs, but as Tina has mentioned, space touches every single sector. Space is wide reaching to the point where we take it for granted because we don't even realize how integrated it is into our society. And so when I'm talking to students or professionals in the industry who are, established professionals, some of them might be near the end of their careers, but still wanted to always work in space and wanted to switch over and find a space career either after they retire from their current job or before they retire altogether. They're trying to figure out where to move into, where are the areas of opportunity for them, where are the areas of growth. And that's where policy can really come in and to open up those areas of growth. I think, Kevin, you mentioned quite a number of the things that I'm about to mention, which is finding ways that we can open up space law, especially international law and US domestic law, to make things a little easier for the space economy here in the US to grow, so that new businesses can start up, new opportunities. We've got data pretty well established right now, and there's so many opportunities for companies to pop up with downstream services using space data. But there's still a lot of opportunity to use the space environment to expand into. For example, I think, Kevin, you mentioned space debris and space satellite servicing. So there's a lot of policy there that still needs to be worked out. Recycling space debris, or recycling defunct satellites, or recycling boosters. That right now is an area of both illegal certainty, where you're just not allowed, and a little bit of gray area where how do you get around that? How do you create a company that wants to recycle the trash that they pick up and make money from that? Or the dual use technology problem, because if you can get too close to a satellite, what is too close? What does that mean? Is that a weapon? So there's a lot of gray area there to be worked out, both domestically and internationally. Ownership, who owns what satellites, and how do you transfer ownership of defunct satellites or defunct companies, or space debris in general? So much of that is an opportunity for businesses to start up globally. We're seeing global businesses start up, but especially here in the United States, where we have a lot of that technology already sort of available, and we just need to test it. And I know of a lot of people who would love to go up there and send up a prototype and test how to grab onto a sat, or how to service a sat, or how to clean up the space environment, and they just can't yet, or they haven't figured that out. And investors are coming to me more and more this year talking about wanting to invest in this kind of technology, and they don't know whether that's a good idea or not, because they don't know whether this is a legal area that will be figured out in the near term or the far term. Another area of conflict I see in space policy here in the United States is how much public-private partnerships do we allow? We see a transition over the past decade of, especially within NASA, of opening up public-private partnerships, specifically with human spaceflight. We saw it with the cargo to the International Space Station, the crew to the International Space Station, and now the various types of transportation to the moon, cislunar space and lunar operations. And we see pushback within Congress, within certain members of Congress, at least not the majority of them, where they like the old way of how it was done, where it was government technology and government operations and government controlled, and therefore governments were, had the final say, and they didn't have to lose control as much as they feel like they're losing control when the commercial company is the owner of the hardware, and a commercial company is the operator of the hardware, and it's a commercial company working with government. And so that's an area not so much of law, but of policy, of how do you convince certain members of Congress that this is a good way to save taxpayer money, while also being good stewards of that taxpayer money and being responsible as we move forward into cislunar and lunar space. And various areas of space manufacturing, these are all areas of potential growth. And when I'm talking to companies, clients, government agencies from around the world, by the way, Nicholas is quite right that a lot of government agencies around the world want to operate in the United States, want to create subsidiaries or partnerships where they can get government contracts. And again, I don't have hard numbers, just anecdotal evidence. But a lot of companies are trying to figure out where that growth area is. And maybe it's selection bias because I am based in the United States, but all of them are coming to me asking, how do they expand to the United States? How do they get partnerships within the United States to conduct their business? And really trying to figure out how to open that up, both the new areas that I'm mentioning. Another one would be things like the satellite internet constellations, where a lot's been talked about this, so I'm not going to go over that. But how do you balance the keen interest, and I myself live in a suburban area with bad internet, and most of the United States does not have very good internet service compared to, say, Europe. How do you balance that desire to serve the masses, the wealthier masses probably, to bring them internet from LEO constellations, low Earth orbit constellations, not GEO, but a little bit closer to home, right? How do you balance that with I have an astronomy background. I understand the astronomy community's concerns of being able to observe. And so that kind of back and forth. Another thing is very hot right now and is going to be just continuing to grow is private spaceflight. And we saw House subcommittee meeting, when was that, Tuesday? Losing track of time this week. But there was a comment made by one of the congresswomen who was concerned about the conflict between private spaceflight, or I should say private astronaut missions, as NASA calls them, and the fact that the International Space Station is a national laboratory, and the whole conflict of when do we retire the ISS and when does Congress provide the money and the go ahead to NASA and to probably different agencies within the Department of Defense to provide industry incentive to buy what they need and provide the contracts to build commercial space stations for humans and commercial outposts for research and development, whatever the case may be. And being able to have that timing just right, so there's not a capabilities gap, but also not an overlap where you've got government hardware competing with commercial hardware, which I don't think is really going to be a problem. I'm more concerned about a capabilities gap. So when you're thinking ahead to a company that either wants to build a space station or a company that wants to operate on a space station, a private space station, I should say, they're trying to figure out the timing of all of this. So government really needs to act because private companies can't do this alone. We haven't seen evidence yet that a private company is willing to put in their own investments to do a full commercial space station that can replicate in any way what we currently have right now. So these are just areas, I'm going to wrap that up, areas where I see that the government needs to be thinking way longer term than they currently are, which that's not what politicians typically do. But that is an area where I know that people are coming to me asking me, how do we plan ahead? How do we plan out our business cases? And this is what I have to tell them is you have to sort of guess which way things are going, the timing of things.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Laura. We do have some questions already in the question and answer section. The first one comes to us from Diane. Do you foresee the future of the space industry being a self-correcting marketplace as within the United States economy? And I'll just open that up to anyone that wants to try and take that on.
Can I just make a kind of snarky comment? Since I just finished the PhD about comparing government interventions in different countries, including it was a free market country like New Zealand and an interventionist market like Singapore. The kind of fundamental premise was there is no self-correcting market. They all depend on government interventions. So that would be kind of regardless of the industry. So that's kind of my sort of snarky response. But
I mean, I think I'll go back to the point I made a bit ago, which is, this is becoming a more normal market. When we saw one company, say in the imagery business or in the communications business, you worried because if the company didn't succeed, you'd have on-orbit assets that had to be protected. You'd have archival data on the ground that had to be protected by law. And so there was an extraordinary worry about that. Now you're in a place where the breadth and the depth of entrepreneurial activity is such that you don't have to worry so much about that. Obviously, the government will intervene if an actor we don't like wanted to acquire those assets, but there are a number of other ways for the market to clear companies that don't quite make it over the line and still use the assets and things like that. So I think it's more normal in that sense. Space, because of its national security legacy in the United States, especially, we always had that sort of extra part of worry about it. And I think we have to worry less about that in the way the market's developing. I don't know if that answered the person's question, but.
Thank you for that, both of you. I've got another one from Arno Nikogosian. How do you develop pricing for future in-space manufacturing? Will this be supply and demand driven? What are your thoughts?
I don't know about the pricing part, but if it's not supply and demand driven, there needs to be an anchor government client for it. Obviously, I mean, again, I think in some ways, I think the interesting thing about the market that I see is that in the old days, so to speak, people were reluctant to be first buyers of space-based capabilities. today they're leaning forward and taking a risk, even from the investor perspective, and saying, okay, that's reasonable, it's technically sound. This is where the relationship between the government and industry is actually very interesting. And Nicholas, I don't know if this fits within your model. You know, we see a world in which the government, and we see it in the United States, we see it in organizations like the Defense Innovation Unit and some of the pitch days and things like that. Because what the government is essentially doing there is saying, hey, there's a small investment of money. It's not tiny, it's substantial to you where you can actually do some real work. And that allows a company to then go into the capital markets and say, okay, I think I have a commercial capability, and you'll get a very quick read in the capital markets on whether investors think you're a purely government contractor for the next 30 years, in which case that's okay too, or you have some level of commercialization associated with your product. And so I think that helps it helps grease, and fuel the space economy, if you will.
Sort of tangential. I don't know how the answer to the question, but that interplay of government contractor and seeking VC, quite tangential. It's not directly answering the question, but I'm working on a project right now where I'm looking at the relationship between VC and the emergence of all these space firms. And a repeating point that comes up, and you mentioned it before, Kevin, was the SPAC IPOs. So, with the VC people, they need an exit, basically. That's the point. That's why they're putting money in. They need to make money. And, as they like to say, at least as I think they like to say, I don't know the VC terminology, but I've heard the term liquidity pathway, they basically getting the money at the end. And the SPAC IPOs are a nice liquidity pathway. So that is, fueling VC into these space firms. And the question that is coming up in these discussions with people I'm having on this project is, are these SPAC IPOs going to ultimately reveal, will it ultimately be found that these companies going public via the SPACs are going to, have less value than people think they are, which seems possible. And then that liquidity pathway will dry up and you'll get less VC. So I guess it's a very, very indirectly tangential to the question of how will, things like in-space manufacturing evolve and become sort of real. It depends on, the liquidity pathway and people seeing value in it. And I guess just something to throw out there is, a lot of the viability of different business areas depends on perception, and then that perception will actually generate, the allocation of resources. So very indirect, but something that's perhaps somewhat relevant to thinking about more kind of left field or out there business segments.
Perfect.
I'd like to, just add that I think the answer is yes, it will be supply and demand driven, but it depends on who's supplying and who's demanding, and also the level of competition. I mean, just generally speaking, the more competition for any service, the prices will decline. If there's not a lot of competition, on the other hand, that prices will be higher than they otherwise would be. So I think the more competition and the more firms that are able to do this type of thing, that will drive prices down. So that's maybe that's obvious, but I just thought I'd add that.
Perfect, thank you. And another question that comes. Oh, go ahead, Kevin. I saw that you came off of mute, or maybe you were still.
No, just a quick point. As we look at developments on the space side of the equation, also pay attention to innovations on the finance side. Again, we've gone from a world in which people would say, gee, space is cool, let's throw $10 million there. We're not sure if it'll work, sort of one of those. We have a much better sense these days of what makes a successful space company. We don't have a perfect sense, but you're starting to see innovations across the spectrum of finance. The VC community, there was a piece in the Journal the other day about private equity, now growing again. Obviously, the advent or the return, if you will, of the SPACs. And then we even see some other ideas. We see an idea of a space bank and a space commodities exchange, and some other things that are out there that people are considering on the finance side that will be as interesting to watch here.
All right, thank you. I see a question that just came up in the chat. Are SPACs not a good investment because you don't know which companies you are investing in? If so, what are better, I'm trying to scroll down here. What are better space investment options? I don't know if any of you can answer that one, but go ahead, Nicholas. I see you've got your hand up.
I'm not a financial advisor, so I don't have an advice for where you should put your money. But when I worked in DC in business intelligence, or like kind of due diligence and business investigations before I moved to New Zealand for my PhD. And Rocket Lab recently did the IPO via SPAC, and I like Rocket Lab, so I'm not trashing SPAC IPOs. But as someone with a background in due diligence, it seems like a horrible idea to me to be investing in the companies that are essentially going public via the SPACs, because you're bypassing all of the transparency and the disclosure requirements that normally, and not all of them, some of them you're getting, but you're basically going in much more blind. There are, without naming names, there are a few space companies who have seriously overvalued themselves, it seems. That at least that's word on the street. Again, and as is the case with most of this stuff, it's all word on the street. No one's really looking at too many numbers, but due diligence, you're bypassing due diligence with SPAC IPOs. And to me, I find it quite interesting that people are so wholeheartedly going for it. To me, it relates back to this kind of cult of Musk, we love space kind of vibe, that people are so into space, they're kind of putting their money where their heart is, without maybe coolly, rationally checking things out. That being said, the SPAC IPOs are awesome because they do make the liquidity pathway, which attracts the VC, which you need. So, this is what was happening in the conversations with the VC people. They're like, well, without the SPAC IPO, why would we put the money in it? We need to see the opportunity for exit. So, good, but yeah, I would urge caution personally.
I think the point you're making about due diligence, the quality of the SPAC event will depend highly on the ability of the people who are doing the merger to do the due diligence they need to do. And you've seen, not just in the space business, but across the board, you're seeing examples of some that are done very well, and you're seeing some that have not been done so well. And the prices of the SPACs tend to run accordingly.
I just wanted to second both of you and say that I think it's been enough time now since the Virgin Galactic SPAC, where we are starting to see some results, and a lot of people question how that began and how that is turning out with Virgin Galactic not getting up to its promises, and Momentous having some issues with their SPAC because of disclosure. So yeah, caution. I recognize that I'm a more conservative investor than some people are. But one thing that concerns me is that it's not just the SPACs. It's something that Kevin just said earlier. Actually, it's all these newer ways to finance. And I'm not a financial expert, but it seems to me it's more experimental. And so experimental means of gaining capital and investing capital can really pay off. But on the other hand, it's sort of a free for all from my point of view as an outsider in the financial industry who has not been following this for several years. Right now, it just seems like people are throwing money in to see what sticks. And there will be some things that stick, and there will be some SPACs that are successful. And I'm rooting for Rocket Lab as well. I'm rooting for Virgin too. But I want them all to succeed, but they will not all succeed, because there are some of them that as all businesses fail, there are some of them that are definitely going to fail, and some of them that have rushed in my opinion, to going public.
Thank you for that. One question also that comes to mind is, what do you foresee as some of the biggest or bigger challenges that U.S. policymakers need to overcome as it relates to economic space policy?
I think one of this question of regulation and modernizing them is very important. Think of it this way: the things that are regulated in law now, launch, communications, remote sensing, those are things that the United States government had decades of experience thinking about before they went commercial. Okay, now entrepreneurs are coming forward with ideas for which the government has no necessary advantage in understanding. They may generally understand the technology. There's a risk that the regulatory regimes for those things could just last forever, at which point, if you're the entrepreneur in business, you go out of business. And so we have to find a way to speed up. Again, Itar has popped up in this conversation. Excellent work done on Itar reforms back in 2017. I think the problem is that Itar, what industry is saying is Itar needs to be refreshed continuously, given the speed of the technology that's moving forward. And so I think that's one big class of things that we need to worry about.
I mentioned this earlier, but ownership is another one, both ownership of what is in our orbit, as well as ownership of space resources. And the United States and several countries are under the interpretation that the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 allows for ownership, a private ownership of space resources, which will allow for things like asteroid mining, lunar mining, Martian mining, and the use of that regolith either where they are in situ or a fuel depot, or there are various other cases. But there are some interpretations in some countries that do not believe that. So really reconciling that, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but that is two contrasting, greatly contrasting views of what do we do, how do we operate, how do we move forward and open up those markets or restrict those markets for people, for companies that want to go out there and use resources out in space. Another one would be, in my opinion, this is a hot button topic, but trying to figure out how to work internationally with our perceived adversaries, our adversaries like China, for example, where we have the Wolf Amendment, and that is a topic of continuous conversation of what do we do with that. It hasn't really worked out over the past decade since it was implemented, with preventing China from developing a space technology, a real space economy, working with international partners. So unless we want to have two global camps, one being the United States and its allies that signed the Artemis Accords, and the other being Russia, China probably with Russia and probably with several other allies, unless we want that, which I don't want, we need to find a way to work together, because there are a lot of things that inherently we need to work together as a global community. Space debris and space traffic management is one of them.
Yeah, definitely space traffic management. Go ahead, Nick.
Not to harp on it so much, but just Itar, I think, is a really important one. I think that Itar is, as I said, the reason Itar is acceptable is because of all the contracts. You have the US space industry is the honeypot, and it's worth dealing with Itar to get to the honeypot. But if the obstacles are so much that it, if the disincentives overwhelm the incentives of engaging with the US space industry, that could ultimately hurt the US space industry and force the emergence of other space industries that are, much more competitive. My background is in due diligence. I think a very similar thing exists in financial markets with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Everyone, all around the world, they want to get money. You go to US financial markets. The US is the winner in terms of national financial markets. Everyone in Europe complains about financial markets. Everyone in Australia, New Zealand complains about it. You want to go to the US. But once you go to the US, you're subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is a severe pain in the butt for doing work in all other parts of the world, where government business relations are a little different. And the reason FCPA is an acceptable obstacle and it doesn't stop people from keep going to the United States is because there's more attraction, there's more incentive than there is disincentive. And I similarly feel with the FCPA that you have kind of like FCPA in financial markets and ITAR in space industry, you need to be very careful because your regulations, you can have onerous regulations if people are attracted to come work in under your jurisdiction. But if you're not careful and those are too onerous, then you're actually going to stop making your market attractive. And then, you're essentially shooting yourself in the foot. So there are many other things, of course, many technologies are beyond regulatory understanding, like space debris, there's tons of stuff like that. But I really think that, to date, it seems like the strength of the US space industry, however you define it, has something to do with being a hub of innovation and cool tech and all that sorts of stuff. And you need to keep attracting talent from around the world to maintain that.
Perfect. So I want to make sure that we get to some of the additional questions in the from the audience. And on this topic, Rose had a question. Wouldn't you say that ITS has been an example of a UN-based traffic cop to coordinate the use of geosync slots? Do you think this role could or should be expanded to manage crowding of other orbits?
I'm assuming we're talking about the ITU here.
Probably.
Yeah, I think on that score, what we're seeing is the space debris problem is a daunting one. It's the bad day in the space economy, quite candidly. And I think the international discussions are underway in UN COPUOS about different governance approaches, things like that. We in the United States prefer a bottoms-up approach that's based on industry best practices. We're required by law to consult with industry in the United States. Because again, the speed of what's happening is taking place so quickly that it's only industry that's going to come up with some practical, rules of the road for space. If you have any access to the Amos videos from last week, Dr. Ruth Stillwell gave a very eloquent description of space traffic management through the metaphor of walking down the street. That was really brilliant and could be understood by anybody. The diplomats will continue to have their conversations, and they should, but I think it's industry that's going to develop the more practical standards and rules of the road to get started. Last point on the international order, the Russians in particular would much rather a legal top-down approach to governing space. We prefer a bottoms-up, voluntary, consensus-based approach, and it's a fundamentally different approach.
If I could add on a related topic, sort of tangentially, but very much related, preventing space debris by banning or in some way discouraging kinetic ASAT tests, that's anti-satellite tests. And I know that there's trade-offs there when it comes to national security, but if we don't want, continuously, creation of new space debris, some of which does go higher than intended in higher orbits and therefore lasts longer, then we need to have both domestic and international policy that states what is acceptable and what isn't.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got another question from the audience. With the coming of Earth launch capability, do you see space regulation looking similar to the airline industry in the future?
I can try to answer that by saying we have no idea because it's such a brand new industry that we just now back in July saw the very first paying customer going on a suborbital hop. All previous flights have been with commercial companies and their own employees. And so we are far from being able to even see regular access just going up and down to the same spot, let alone to other places. But that is the long-term business plan, whether or not it can succeed for some of these companies. I'm thinking specifically of Virgin Galactic, of being able to do point-to-point transportation, just thinking of it as an airline. I know Starship by SpaceX is another example of this, with not passengers, but cargo. And I just think we're way too early to be able to answer your question, but it absolutely, I used to work for a company that wanted to do this. And it's a lot of regulations that haven't been written yet in terms of how to integrate the both the air systems and the ways that for example, here in the United States, the way the FAA looks at this, and also the way that international countries will look at this.
Yeah, Laura's right. It's too soon to tell in this sense, and we need to work on it hard and fast. There's sometimes a temptation to think that what goes on in air traffic control is the same thing as needs to go on in space traffic management, but they couldn't be, other than the fact they're both about safety, they couldn't be more different. Their jurisdictional issues are different, the technical issues are different, and frankly, the speed of how the problem is changing is very, very different. And so we have to be careful about those parallels. Both the launch aspects and the on-orbit aspects are really important, but they might be more different than you think.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And we've got a comment from Arno Nikogosian, who believes that we are already working together with Roscosmos on ISS and several planetary missions. ESA is bridging US and Russia. Intellectual property rights should be resolved to have meaningful collaboration with PRC. The international collaboration is complex given the potential for dual use technology. ESA will demonstrate next year the potential for space to be removable with commercial help. So thank you for that comment, Arno. We do still have time for additional questions, so go ahead and go those in the Q&A section if you have any. I do have one, and being mindful of the different types of people that this conference brings together, I want to be mindful for those students in the room. And so when you think about the current state of space economic policy, what do you see are some gaps in the research that people should really start thinking about we need to do some additional work on to help give us some better information moving forward?
Well, I can maybe chime in here a little bit. In terms of policy, you often need data, good data to understand and think about policy and think about the future. And I just kind of went through this project and can attest to the fact that we don't have a lot of great data when it comes to space-related goods and services. So I think that just changing, this is probably a boring answer, but maybe changing the way we collect data, changing the surveys. Kevin, you'll be happy to know that we're going to get our own census question about space launch added to the next census, because currently it's just a lot of space activity is so new, and we are capturing it in the overall economy, but we might not be capturing it in the right place. And so I think that just thinking about data is important, just so that policymakers, are able to think about this appropriately. So, thank you.
That chimes so true with me. I was recently, I went to, shout out for SAIS, my grad school in DC, and a lot of them are economists. And I was just talking with some of them who don't care about space. And I was just like, man, remember a lot of them work for the World Bank or the IMF or various government agencies. I'm like, there's just not similar reporting on that I can tell on the space industry. The one thing I would just add to what Tina said is, yeah, there needs to be consensus. There is no consensus between any two people about what the space industry is, partially because it spreads into every other part of the economy. But then there needs to be standards internationally as well, because knowing what's happening in the US kind of only matters if you can compare to what's happening in other countries, right? I mean, that's, everything is comparative. So there needs to be, probably the US will lead it, the places that have a more developed industries and more capacity to try and make sense of how you define it and measure it. And then that will spread to other countries. We need a standard way of measuring and comparing, because that's the only way you can, identify the goals or, figure out whether you're succeeding in advancing them.
Tremendous opportunities for the students on the line. They can, first of all, they can add to the 5 space economists that exist on the planet. So there's a lot of work to be done. I gave you a whole bunch of things that were categories of areas to be worked. And I think there's a lot of opportunity. Not only think is there opportunity, I think it's a necessity, because we have to understand what's going on under the hood of the space economy, if you pardon that phrase, to make sure that we continue to move it in the right direction responsibly, et cetera, and so that we can all take advantage of it.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And I see Arno in the chat also had mentioned the need to update the Outer Space Convention. And I guarantee there's going to be some research that can be done around that as well for those students on the line. Thank you all for participating today. I don't know if you have any questions for each other, but I do want to be respectful of your time. Again, this was a tremendous conversation. I always appreciate being part of these. So thank you everyone for participating today.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you very much.
Nice to see everybody.
Thank you.